standards in the environmental world means the allowable limits of contamination. And we don't have arguments about that. That's not where the conflict comes.
Why don't you have arguments about that?
Because the standards are set by the government. The standards are set by the law.
They're the law.
They're the regulations. What is the conflict does come in is, okay, here is the technical solution that is proposed in order to get at the contamination and to satisfy the standards. Oftentimes there's a disagreement, particularly if one technical alternative is more expensive than another. There's often a disagreement regarding which cleanup method you should use to meet those standards.
But environmental impact statements, for example, by independent parties are frequently written to say the standard for radiation is, standard for following toxic chemical is. However, from the point of view of the scientist writing it, that standard is incorrect. It may be the law, but it's not the right standard. And the community ought to know that that's not correct.
Okay, so I think
I don't understand I still don't understand the answer to my question. Are you trying to take that more independent stance, or are you essentially always going along with the PA?
I don't think we've ever had a case, and correct me if I'm wrong, where we've been asked to evaluate the accuracy or inaccuracy of a standard. Usually what it is the process that's being followed. Are they abiding by the standards or are they not? And that's where, when it's a law, we are not there actually to question or evaluate the value of the law. It's usually the standard plays some sort of role in the bigger issue that we are being asked to facilitate or mediate. But I don't think that we've ever been in that position.
So from the point of view of, say, a landowner, the kind of person you're talking about, they wouldn't necessarily, if there was a let's say where there may not be, if there was a standard that was involved in this sort of thing, they wouldn't necessarily know that there are other opinions about what the standards ought to be.
Okay, I think what you're getting at is not necessarily arguing about what the standards are, but which standards you use. In other words, we're not necessarily arguing about
or whether to use any standards.
What?
Or whether to use any standards at all.
Yeah. Okay. If the project is in the context of a regulatory program, chances are standards will apply. There is some interpretation that can come into play when you try to choose which of the state or local regulations, the applicable regulations that must apply to your cleanup. So that, it's not necessarily arguing about the standard of, how many parts per million of lead or whatever the technical issue is more or less the conflict could arise over, well, does our cleanup really have to address this standard? Is it an appropriate standard? And to my knowledge, we have not been involved in that. But you bring up another question of whether even standards should apply at all, and I'll use that to get back to my case study, and I'll wrap that up pretty quickly. In this case, with the landowners who had the petroleum problem, after several meetings, there was an agreement to go forward and create this group, and there was also a commitment on the part of EPA and the state to enter into a memorandum of understanding that would explain or document this voluntary agreement. So the private parties met over several months, and what they did is they focused their discussions on technical criteria. In other words, all right, if we're all going to work together as a group and we're going to voluntarily determine whether or not we have a problem related to petroleum contamination, and then if we do have a problem, we'll fix it, let's have that discussion focus on technical issues, and let's determine that the technical criteria that we'll use, and no standards were used. The only standard that they decided to use was the major criteria was, well, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have to participate in this project if it's found that free-phase hydrocarbon is found in wells that were sinking along your property. That was it. And it's not how much. It was just if it occurs. And there was a definition for free-phase hydrocarbons, which was the only standard that applied. But there were no sort of regulatory standards that were used. So at any rate, after a series of meetings with the private parties, the the technical criteria was negotiated and the terms and conditions were spelled out in a draft agreement that then went to EPA and the state. There were several rounds of exchange which aren't even over yet, but there is the basic agreement has been worked out, and some of the parties have actually moved ahead as far as putting together their technical projects and getting their technical consultants together and moving forward with the studies that they agreed to in this agreement. So at any rate, that's I don't want to go on and on about the case study because it seems like you all have some questions on that, but to me it was an exciting project because I think we demonstrated in an area where the normal course of action is to use a heavy regulatory stick. Demonstrated that there is an alternative way of getting at it, and to use more of a mediated approach, you can achieve a cooperative project that is working towards the same environmental goals in a way that the private parties can participate in. The government was enthusiastic about it because they will end up saving some money in the long run because they don't have to get together so many different cases. The private parties are pleased to do it because they can control the process a little bit. Quite often in these environmental cases, the regulation, going through the regulatory process, the enforcement process dictates what so closely what it is that a private party has to do. In this case, they were able to have some control on that and define the technical aspect themselves and to pursue it. And that's what held that group together, is the sense that they could actually control this, and if they controlled it, then they could save some money on it. And so long as everyone agreed, including the government, as to what the technical criteria were and what the environmental goals were, then everything would be okay. So that's where it stands right now, and the process still goes on. But it's, I think, a pretty interesting case study to illustrate sort of an alternative way in which mediation is used in some of these environmental cases.
Was that their ability to control the project, was that really the selling point for getting it to accept participating in it?
That was one. The other one was they wanted people in it to know, particularly in Northwest Indiana, that the government asked them. If the government believed that they had a problem and asked them to address it, they wanted to demonstrate that they were willing to do that. So there was a public relations. They perceived a public relations benefit to doing this as well.
Did they have to have any kind of assurance that if they didn't succeed in accomplishing this, that there would be no reprisal from the government? Or, I mean, if I were a landowner, I think my concern would be, well, am I inviting the government to look closely at my property or my facility? And I'm sure they're really afraid that they have all sorts of other environmental problems, and I think that they need that kind of assurance. So.
Yeah, and part of the agreement that was worked up provided for confidential handling of information, and so that and it was interesting because they were very worried about that, and the government was also worried about that because they didn't want to have to be in a position of what they wanted to do was to clear their way to use an enforcement action if they ever had to do it. So they did not want to give the private parties a free ride in any way. So they didn't want to accept technical information because they didn't want to be perceived as approving it. So what they wanted was the answers to two questions. One, do you have a problem? So provide us the answer, yes or no. If the answer is yes, the second question is, are you putting the right kind of technical measures in place to address the problem?
And they're asking that of the owner, but then they're not asking you to do that consultation to tell them those two questions. You were there just to mediate the process.
Right.
So it wasn't like a straight consulting firm in the environmental area that would come in and study the site.
No, what would happen, and this would be the second phase of the project, is that there would be each of the individual property owners would hire their own consultants to do whatever work, and if they chose to work with a neighboring property to save costs, they're certainly able to do that. There will be a mediator involved to keep the group together, to facilitate the continued discussions of the group, and to assist in any communication between the group and the regulatory agencies, and that was by the request of the private parties.
Is there any participation by the public or public interest groups type of discussions you're talking about?
No, and that's a very good question. That's a big concern among the environmental community in Northwest Indiana. They were kept informed in an informal way. They were not participating in the negotiations. The agreement that the private parties in the EPA have drafted provides for public involvement in future information and discussions and whatnot. But as far as a role for the interest groups in determining what the technical criteria was, and that certainly was not provided for.
What is the reason that the public was not involved?
The parties wouldn't sit at the table if that's.
So was that an additional inducement to get from the table, is to know that at this point at any rate they can keep the public concerns out of the discussion?
Yes.
Now, how do you get around general public interest and Open Meeting Act type of concerns, which would tend to indicate you have to have public input?
The meetings were never government-sponsored meetings.
Or hearings.
They were not hearings. So it was not the government holding a meeting. It was either private parties holding a meeting or police sites holding a meeting.
Is that being perceived by the environmental community as finding a loophole, or is it being seen as a good faith effort to comply with the spirit of the act?
The unfortunate reality is that the environmental community is very, very used to being shut out of the negotiations in Northwest Indiana, which I think is a problem. And actually, I think that it would be very interesting to see an evolution of this process to provide for using public information and public concerns in those negotiations. I mean, it wasn't going to happen in this case. And I think that it probably won't happen until people get a few more under their belts and then get more comfortable in opening up that process. But at the moment, at the time of convening, when we asked under what circumstances would you come and sit down and work on this, that was one of the circumstances that they would have the ability to have private, confidential meetings, and that the information they exchange would be kept that way.
So you could, a community group could come to you and hire you because A, they like your mission, B, they like your technical expertise, and C, and not where you're a mediator, facilitator. The government can do that knowing you've got an environmental background and you are more than a traditional just straight mediator because you've got the technical background. Corporations can do it, but they could be nervous because you've got the environmental mission or you've got EPA connections, so to speak. But Amoco, a Dow could come to you and ask you to do it. Do they ever question because of the mission whether you're really going to give them the fair shake that somebody was talking about here?
Well,
I know you're saying you take them case by case and you're neutral,
yeah.
but do they ever say?
I think, to be honest, we've had more concerns about the public being concerned about credibility because we receive funding from industry. So it's probably less of the opposite.
Even though your mission right on the box is that you protect the environment.
Well, the mission, I've got copies of the annual report if people want them, but the mission is to address America's hazardous waste problem. I mean, there's sort of a broad, and wouldn't be an objectionable mission to anybody.
And corporations are not objecting to that mission. You'd be surprised at how environmental.
Well, I know developers.
I understand, or I understood you to say that the government is not waiving, for instance, prosecution of the major pollution problem that one of the landowners has. So they're not, as part of the process, waiving that. But I was a little unclear about the landowner's technical information about their particular property. Where did that go to? It didn't go directly to the government, is what I understood.
The agreement, the draft agreement, talks about the developing these various reports. There is a reporting function, but the reporting function is limited to answering very simple questions. It's not necessary to provide every single analytical result that comes out of the groundwater monitoring network, for example. The reporting is basically to say to the government, yeah, I've got three-phase hydrocarbons in my property, and I am putting in, and I know that because I took several samples and we found it. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to put in a barrier system and a pump and treat system in order to prevent that from getting into the river. And then I'll let you know 3 months down the line or a year down the line or whatever when that's when that's moving along and give you progress on it. But the very specific analytical results of that sampling was not going to be included in those reports, even though that would be generated and would be handled.
Why is this not something which a government administrator, bureaucrat, whatever, why isn't it something that they could do on their own without hiring an independent contractor if they were simply open-minded and responsive?
They certainly could do that, and in many cases the government does try to do that. In Northwest Indiana and some of these other areas, the relationships are very contentious, in that the people have been sued. In that area, these what I referred to earlier as multimedia cases, these major environmental lawsuits that were being developed by EPA have people scared and skittish, and they would much rather not talk to the government. They would much rather not have any relationship until they absolutely had to. So it was a whole lot easier in this case for the private parties to talk to me than it was to the person in charge of the regulatory program in a free and open way. Obviously, they needed to talk to that person at some times, but it was an advantage to them to do that. I'm going to take another question, then I want to make sure Helen talks about her project.
It's interesting.
Just wanted to know, I guess it's a technical question as to why bother to clean up at all. I mean, pre-phase hydrocarbons stop moving after a while anyway. Is it that the groundwater is so close all the time to all of the sites where this was largely a remediation problem or an ongoing problem?
The project was not a remediation project. The project was a source control project, and the distinction keeps you out of a regulatory program, actually, is what it is. If it's not a cleanup program, then you don't have to worry about those standards that we were talking about earlier. What this was about was putting in a barrier or somehow pumping out this product so it didn't mingle with the surface water.
But the pump and treat systems have generally not worked, so that's why I don't understand. I mean, generally pre-phase hydrocarbon stops moving by itself. So unless it's going to come to either the water, I mean, it's going to move to the water table, more or less stop at some distance from whatever the source is by itself.
Okay, well,
so,
yeah.
And many of the petroleum companies, like Shell, for example, frequently go to the states and the federal government and say, basically, we'll do it if you force us to, but it's really not very cost effective, and so unless we're talking about something that is very toxic and clearly going to move in phases of moving into the water.
Well, what we're talking about is an area where there's been a significant amount of petroleum activity because of all the refineries, and there has been a reported 16 to 60 million gallons of petroleum product floating on top of the groundwater. So there's a bunch, more than spilled in the Exxon Valdez. So there's a concern about it among the agencies. Also, if you ever go down to the Grand Canyon and the Indiana Harbor Canyon, you can see it floating on top of the water. So there's visual evidence. It's in an area that's ranked as an absolute priority for cleanup. And basically what's happening in that area is there's a lot of remediation going on. They're going to be dredging the Harbor Canal. The Army Corps of Engineers is doing that. Several different lawsuits up and down the river have resulted in the private parties having to do that. And what EPA was concerned about is that, we just don't want it to get any worse. So that's why we want to know whether or not there's any petroleum that's migrating from these properties into the surface water. And if there isn't, fine. End of story. If there is, we want it stopped. And their message to industry was, well, you can do that by yourselves and in a way that you can develop and control, or we can compel you to do it. And
so if I was a landholder in this situation and I felt that I knew about where the movement stopped and it didn't seem to be getting to groundwater, even though there was contamination, I probably wouldn't do anything within the context of what you described. If I felt it was moving far enough to get into the groundwater and move into major drinking water areas, not just getting groundwater, to actually get to.
Right.
And then I would want to do something.
And in this case, the reason why it's an area of concern designated as such is that the pollution that gets in that river goes into the lake, which is very close to the drinking water sources for systematic purpose. So there's a concern on that note. Another little twist on this is that the The reason why this thing hasn't finished up yet is because even though we got so very, very far, there ended up being a disagreement within US EPA regarding this project between the Office of Regional Counsel, which is the attorneys, and the technical staff. And there's a little bit of irony in there, saying that it was EPA who was, got this thing launched in the first place. So there are some issues with the agreement that still are being negotiated and need to be worked out. And I think everybody was so surprised that the private parties were able to get convened and to work through a process and develop a decent program so quickly. And now the hang-up is not whether or not these parties will do it, but whether EPA can resolve their own internal issues and allow this to happen.
Just one quick point of clarification. In this process, were you primarily targeting two sides, namely the EPA at the federal level on the one side and landowners on the other side? Or
it involved the landowners, EPA, and the state. So you could say that there were really three groups. And in each of those groups there were multiple parties. So in the landowner group there were 6 parties. In the state side there was about 3 or 4 divisions. And with an EPA side there was 1 division, the water division. And that has been the problem that's now surfaced, is that there was a silent party that has not participated and didn't sort of show up until further along in the process, and that's what's being worked out now. So, and that I think is another very interesting dynamic to this whole case, is how that there were so many different parties and different groups. And if I were to do it again, I would make sure that I tried to flush all those parties sooner rather than later in the process.
to what extent do you find there was a conflict at state versus federal levels? You said
There was an enormous conflict on the state and federal level, which got resolved early in the process. The state and the federal government had a disagreement on various issues, but they worked it through. And the EPA really put a lot of pressure on the state. But it worked itself out, I think, in a way that everybody was favorable to.
I could share a couple of war stories along that line with you later.
Yeah. And now that I said that, I realize that there's a camera going, so not to get into the details.
Watch the news tonight.
Mine were not in the Midwest.
Yeah. Okay, well, Helen's going to talk about a completely different case.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to explain was the nature of the agreement for the case that I'm going to describe. In this project, we have what is called a cooperative agreement with EPA, and that might also address some of the questions that you had about if EPA is paying the bill, how are you neutral, et cetera. A cooperative agreement, by its nature, is something that enables us to be quite independent, because theoretically, they cannot dictate you to have you do services for them. The idea is that the grant is given for a certain purpose, and you're somewhat of a free agent and an equal partner. And that allows for some freedom, quite a bit of freedom actually. And I think as a result, we don't really have too many concerns about falling down on the side of maybe not necessarily appearing to be supportive of the EPA's positions, et cetera. And I think that's how we end up being perceived as quite fair and open in these processes. In this project, unlike Tim's, which was a focus on private sector parties coming together, this was a group of 12 jurisdictions around the Lake Erie planning process. There's an agreement called the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement between Canada and the U.S. that requires that a plan be created for each lake, and it's called a lake-wide management plan, and it's a plan to try to address the contamination concerns that each lake has. And so and they're all at different phases of the decision-making process in creating these plans. And we got into this kind of in the middle of their planning process, because they kind of had an emergency situation where they were without a facilitator. Their facilitator up to this point had actually been someone from one of the jurisdictions. So this was a big step for this group to take in going with an outside party. There was not one of them. The 12 jurisdictions include federal level of Canadian environmental government, US EPA, all the states, provinces, and then some interesting entities such as fisheries organizations. So that it wasn't quite, it was quite a mixture, is probably the best way to summarize it. They had been working for about 9 months to come up with a focus for how they were going to address Lake Erie's contamination concerns, and they hadn't really in that 9 months gotten very far except to reveal the fact that they all had very different ways of perceiving what the scope of this plan should be. So our role in this case was to come in and try to help them build consensus and come to agreement on what needs to be addressed and where they're going to, how are they going to do that, and also the management structure for doing that. What I thought was interesting is before coming here, I looked at the Daily Center model on how we go about our mediations and kind of compared it to see how much of what we all do in our voluntary program is similar to the process that we follow. And actually, there was striking similarity where it was incredibly important to make that opening statement. You know, I was looking at literally the steps that we go through, and that opening statement had to be something that set the rules for how I was going to run that meeting with the 12 jurisdictions, explaining that it's their process, not mine. You know, now in this case, very different from Tim's. His was a voluntary process. They really could walk away. These people had jobs in the government. They had to figure this out, so they couldn't exactly walk away from the process, which also helped me in momentum in making sure, you know, we knew we had to get out of there somehow with some sort of resolution. Everyone was skeptical that we could do it in a 2-day time frame, though, because it was a massive undertaking. And it was also, that opening statement was the time that each of us in our mediations earned the trust of the people at the table, just by how we behave and act and speak, etc. So one of the things that's different, though, and I find this interesting about people that do facilitation, because I know that there are a lot of organizations out there that say they do facilitation. But from what I understand, they also explain it as, yeah, we can come in cold, we can, you know, work with a blank sheet of paper and kind of bring you to consensus. And there's a very open brainstorming process, a way that you identify all the issues and you come down to a resolution. A very simple description there. But I honestly have problems with that. I really think that there has to be an incredible immersion in the information that you're working with. You really do have to understand, for my work, you really have to understand what you're working with beforehand. And so an incredible amount of prep went into this facilitation beforehand. I find it very hard to understand how you can do that at certain levels of the work that we do without being immersed in it. So that does differ from us going into the Daily Center and, you know, cold, getting the information and trying to work it through. It was, yeah.
Are you saying being immersed in the technical issues or knowing about conflicts between the various parties and their positions before they come in?
All of the above, as much as you can get.
So you don't know the whole history of the dispute before you start?
That's my feeling in this type of scenario. It was hard for me in retrospect to imagine how I could have done it without having some...
How do you get there? Do you interview each of the people?
Yeah, as much as possible. In some projects, I've actually, before coming to a roundtable session, actually spoken with every single player beforehand to just, one, it's a way of earning trust. Two, it's a way of just getting a feel, because people are amazingly frank about how they feel about the other participants. And that always shocks me, especially even over the phone, that I can, you know, sometimes I flatter myself that I have a trusting voice, but I really think that people are just blunt anyway, more often than not. And it's also the technical issues. When you're dealing with people that are professionals in their job, they're very skeptical of this touchy-feely sort of facilitation stuff. And, you know, are we going to play trust games? You know, I tell that from that group, you know, was I going to make them go through all these contortions of game playing and stuff? Yeah.
But on the same question then, in an environmental mediation, you're saying that you should be more immersed in aware and understanding of environmental issues. Somebody says they're a neutral objective mediator, but they don't really know a bird from a bee, so to speak. Then you're saying you really should in environmental.
Well, I should preface that with the fact that I don't have a technical degree. So I don't, actually, I'm not a chemist or an engineer. So in that case, I guess what I'm saying, no, you don't have to actually understand free-range hydrocarbons necessarily in all their behavior or something. But I do think that you had to understand, I guess, enough to understand the vocabulary of what they're talking about. You know, what is a toxic? What is what are loadings. These are all vocabulary terms that it's all in speak with agencies. And the more you can understand the language and understand what can and can't make sense, the more effective you're going to be, I strongly feel, because in every subculture of any of these organizations we all work with, people begin to just repeat sort of phrases, pat phrases